All right. I feel like I need to talk really quiet in a spa voice after that music. Like, are you relaxed, Doyle? Do you feel ready for this?
Could you just hit right there, just with a little pressure?
Right, like let me light some incense and let's get ready for this thing. um, Welcome back, Doyle. It's been a little while since we chatted, but we're live on Doyle's site and the At Home Songwriting YouTube. So Doyle Turner is our guest. Doyle, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Chad. It's always a pleasure. I wish people were able to hear some of the pre-show because we just dove right into songwriting.
Oh, I know. We were talking, and I'm like, let's talk about that when we actually go live. So,
Right.
um, I don't remember the last time we chatted. Was it earlier this year, or was it last year?
It was last year sometime, I think maybe about 9 months ago. Um,
Okay.
yeah. So the only reason I looked it up is I was doing an artist resume for something I was doing, and then I put that on there, and like, oh, it's been about 9 months.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, because I think last time we talked, you had another album coming out. You also came out with the International Treasures album.
Right.
And so you've had tons of stuff that you've been doing. And now this year, you've been working on another album. So I thought I want to catch up with you and kind of see what you have going on. So yeah, what's been happening?
Yeah, we just released the second single off of an album that's going to be titled Paper Maps, and this was the title track off the album, and we dropped that yesterday. Yeah, so I think the last time we talked, I was busy getting that through pre-production, and I feel like this album I took a lot longer than I normally do. The first EP I did took us 18 months, and we just were so painstaking about it. And not that it was painful, but that it was just, we were very, very precise about how we adjusted it and what we wanted. And it turned out beautifully. And then this time, I wanted some of that back. And so I went through this process pretty slowly. I did several months of pre-production with the person who ended up producing this album, Sarah Morris. And I feel like by the time we got to about May, early May here, all of the people who were involved kind of sat me down and had a little intervention and said, Doyle, we have to release this. When's the day? We can't we can't draw this out any longer. And I'm like, but wait.
So when you talk about pre-production, then are you talking about, do you have the songs written and then you go into the studio and like what is that process like for you? I know it's different for different people. So when you say pre-production, what does that mean?
Well, this was the first time I'd ever really done a formal pre-production type of situation. But what I had was probably 14 or 15 songs. And Sarah asked if I would make a playlist of the songs that were influencing me at that time. And so I gave her a bunch of songs, and then she went through the songs I'd written, listened to the playlist I'd made. And then it was such a fascinating process because it involved, I thought it was going to be, oh, well, we're going to plan for a cello here, or we're going to, maybe tweak this line or whatever. And it was all these deep philosophical questions. And I believe what she was getting at was, which of these songs are going to be able to live together as a family? And
Mm.
once we decided which ones we were pretty sure of, then when we hit the studio in January, we that's when a lot of that happened in terms of the tweaking of the lyrics, or oh, let's try this instrument here. And that was completely different than my process before, which is kind of the reason I went this route. Is I wanted to shake up my process.
So you just said you were in the studio in January
Mhm.
and the album's coming out in November.
Right.
So when did you wrap up the recording process?
That started to finish up about it was the last part of July. I mean, excuse me, the last part of June, right? We left for a trip in first part of July. And so as I was getting, the night before we were getting ready to go, we were still bandying about different things that we needed to be done. And yeah, so it was basically all wrapped up by June 30th.
So what I love about that is you know, for people who haven't made an album with other people, like actually kind of the way that you do it and the way that you plan the marketing and all of that stuff. Like, I think a lot of people think, well, my music's done, so I'm just going to put it out like next week, right? Like the song's done. Like that's if you really want to do it the right way, it doesn't happen that way, which I think is great.
Yeah, it's an interesting deal. After my first two albums that I did, we finished, and I did both of those with my friend Troy Foss from Supple Studios. And after we sent it off to be mastered, or when we're listening to the masters or whatever, he said, "Now what are you going to do?" And I said, "We're done. We're all set." And he's like, "You're halfway there." And I was like, "No, no." And he really taught me that the promo part of it is about the same amount of effort. That you have to give that part of it that kind of effort as well. And it's such a thankless task in a lot of ways, because you just never see it goes out and you don't see all of the results. You see some of the results, but
Sure.
you don't see all the results of it. But yeah.
So I want to go back to something you said about how Sarah worked with you. Sarah Morris, local to Minneapolis, singer-songwriter. Awesome that you worked with her to produce. When she said make a playlist, she was basically talking about reference tracks, right? So songs that are kind of by other artists that are moving you at the time. Was that hard to put together? What was that process like?
It was difficult for me because I am all over the board. I've always listened all over the board. And so, when I'm putting these things together, I'm like, well, how does this kind of more rock oriented song even live with this Guy Clark stuff, And we ended up through this process kind of funneling down, and I was able to make notes. I really like how the production is here, or I really like this instrument at this point in this song, or I like how everything drops out right here. Stuff that you're familiar with as you do your work. But then what we ended up funneling down to was a Guy Clark song, "My Favorite Picture of You." And what I loved about that song was it's very spare in instrumentation, and it moves like you can see the handoff from the bass, the upright bass, to the guitar. You can hear all of this. Everybody steps forward and takes a little bit throughout the whole song, and I really like that acoustic, that string sound, that spare approach, and so that became our reference track for the album.
So interesting. So how many songs did you have on the reference playlist?
Too many. I had like 40 of them, and that poor woman, she had to listen to all of that.
So you literally based the whole album on one song?
Mm-hmm. We used that as a reference track for how production would sound, for lyrically. There's something in Guy Clark's lyrics and the way they're delivered that, especially in that song, that I wanted the lyrics to be forefront. I wanted any kind of poetry I can summon in what I write to be kind of forward in the whole thing.
This is super interesting to me. So did you have that song picked out and then you started writing some of the songs, or did some of the songs exist and then you sort of produce them in that style?
It would be the second thing you described there, because all of our songs were in the bunch of songs I handed off would have been July it would have been October of last year. That's when I handed all that stuff off. No, I was working on some of it earlier with her in the summer too, but all of those songs just went shooting at her. And then the reference track, we decided 2 or 3 weeks before we went into the studio, and that really did, because then I could send it to my people playing instruments and say, here's what we're kind of shooting for. And it was so funny because I had a really well-respected producer take a listen to 3 tracks when we started the mixing stage, and we asked him to comment on how is this sounding. Are we heading the right way? And the one song he said in his notes, we didn't give him any information. He said, "This sounds like Guy Clark." And Sarah and I are like, yes.
Success. Paul Beckerman, hey Paul.
Hi, Paul.
Has a question. How did the reference track impact your actual recording process? That's a great question.
Um, I think that having that in the musicians' ears really affected how they performed that. This was the first time I've ever recorded where I didn't play guitar. And
Mm.
that was really awkward for me. But the guitarist came in and took some of the things that different licks and riffs that I had, provided. And I even did videotape of, my fingers moving. So he would, kind of a shortcut for him. And he said, oh, you know what you did is great, but we're just going to take a section of it and we're going to pull that out. And that's going to be the lick that is kind of the signature lick for that song. And so it was that Guy Clark reference track is really spare. And so Dan Schwartz is the fellow who played the guitar, and he just pulled stuff out of what I gave him and then came up with stuff that fit more at the ends of phrases, or was more of a driving rhythm. And then a section of what I gave him as he kind of I don't want to say arranged it, but he had an approach that matched the sound of that song.
So you said awkward as a way to describe having someone else play. Did that feel a little bit like giving up the reins? If you're used to being your own accompaniment, like how did that feel for you?
It was really difficult leading up to the days in the studio. And once we started tracking we tracked all the instruments simultaneously as much as we could. And then I sang a scratch track. And as we started, Dan would say, oh, here's what you'd had, but I was thinking maybe this should be a 3/4 time thing. And I was like, what? And then he'd start playing it and the bass would jump in and the drums. And I was like, this is beautiful. And so when I first started recording, my friend Lance Benson said, you over prepare everything, but you leave about 10-20% for studio magic. And this felt like I didn't have the preparation phase. And then when I went in, it felt like so much more studio magic because I had these amazing players who could interpret what I'd written in different ways. So it says my name on the album, but oh my gosh, does this album belong to Sarah and Dan and Matt Blake and Nate LeDrum, or Nate LeBrun, excuse me. LeDrum is his social media handle.
Cool. It's so fascinating to me because it's really not how I work. Like I'm such a 100%er.
Yeah.
I'm writing, I'm producing, I'm mixing, I'm mastering. Like I'm like self-contained one-man show. Like I grew up listening to Prince was my idol, right? Like everything was Prince and everything that I do is Chad, right? So I've actually thought about what would it be like for me to do what you did, where I write some songs and create an album and actually have other people play and do that stuff. So to me, there's a level of like control that I give up. And also there's a level of money
Yeah.
I give up. So,
Yep.
I mean, is that something you take into consideration? I know this is not your first album, but how does money play into this?
Oh my gosh, money is such a huge deal because I was the lucky recipient of a state of arts board grant, and so I had a portion of that grant to be able to do this album,
Awesome.
which was awesome. But this was expensive stuff, and you know it because you're a do-it-yourselfer person who saves all of this money, and I can't do all of the skills you've got. And as the budget started to get smaller, the available funds started to get smaller and smaller. I could just feel myself tighten up, and but I mean, here's the thing: every time you do something creative, there's always you're in the sandbox, and there's always boundaries, right? And two of the big ones are always time and money.
Yeah.
There'll be other ones that come up, and a friend told me that years ago, and I was like, okay, that makes sense, but boy, have I lived it. And it's really reassuring for me because I know that it doesn't matter if I'm on an $11 million budget or a $5,000 budget or a $500 budget. I'm playing in the same constraints, within the same constraints, and that's what builds art. Art always comes from bumping up against the edges. And so as frustrating as it is, it's also like, oh, this is just the process.
So I love what you just said because I agree with that. That limitation leads to creativity, right? So do
Mhm.
you think by taking your album down to one reference track, do you think that that also helped with the creativity in the studio? Like, because you were giving yourself lines to color in, right? Like,
Mhm.
it didn't sound like you were going to be adding a drum machine anytime soon, right? Like, you didn't have all the options.
And I think it really did I've never thought of that, so it's an excellent question. But I think it really did in our choice of players, because we have, we decided to record in the Twin Cities area, so we had this plethora of people that are amazing at what they do, and we started going through and saying, okay, who can do this style, right? Who can do this? Who can offer us this? The other thing that was really interesting is I sat in a jazz critique one time. There was a person from the Dave Matthews Band who came up and critiqued some uh, college and high school jazz quartets or jazz ensembles. And
Wow.
one of the things that he said was, he pointed at the drummer and he pointed to the bass player after they played their song. He says, "You two are really good friends, aren't you?" And they're like, "Yeah." He says, "Outside of the music, right?" And they said, "Yeah, how did you know?" He says, "I can tell how you play together." And he says, "Good friends always make the best musicians." And so when we landed on one of the players, we asked him, "Who do you enjoy playing with? Who brings you joy to sit in, across from and play?" And we weren't always able to make that connection work because these really skilled people are also really busy.
Mm.
But it was something that I think comes through in the vibe of the album and the groove of the album.
So, what is that process like? Are you asking for people to submit sort of like audition tapes, or like how did you select who you were gonna pick?
It's a lot like herding cats. Because all of these musicians, they have, you think about all the connections you have as a musician or a songwriter, they've all got all these connections too. And so they're constantly, all of these offers are popcorning up for them. And one of the people who we really wanted to work with only had part of a day to offer us. And so we're just like, we wanted that person so badly. We said, yes, we'll take you for whatever time you can bring. So yeah, it's a lot of texting back and forth and trying to make days work, and you don't think of that kind of stuff when you are thinking of making an album, but it eats up your time and it eats up your energy, and um, but there's also a certain amount of serendipity I believe in, because it it worked out how it was supposed to. We got the players on the tracks how it was supposed to, and we even though we had a bunch of players, we rarely had to go back and say, "Oh, this no, we need somebody else here." And so I want to jump back a couple of questions, because you talked about this being a completely different direction.
Yeah.
And I was in a conversation with three really respected songwriters and friends, and we were on a road trip, and it was awesome because you're contained, right? And you're able to talk about these things. And
Yeah.
they were all saying, "Oh, you know what? You need to change up your process. You need to change up your process because it's going to bring out something different in you. It means growth, all this stuff." And Doyle sat in his little minivan seat and said, "Absolutely not. I'm going to record where I've always recorded. I'm going to do it the same way I always do it." And I put both heels firmly in the floorboards, and I was like, "Never, right?" But that
Wow.
worked on me. And about 10 months after that, I found myself talking to a friend and saying, I'm really heartbroken because I just decided to record somewhere else, and I love where I've always recorded, and I have to talk to my friend and say, this is something I have to do for me as an artist. And but my feeling was always to stick with the same person. But I think the more you can shake it up, the more you grow as an artist. At least I hope so.
Yeah. So while you were talking, I was thinking back to like when you and I first met. Like, I don't even know if you had actually released music at that point. I don't recall if you had or not, but I feel like you've grown so much from just sort of writing songs like as, and this isn't the right word, but just as a hobby, right?
Mhm.
But then you started to release music and like you're taking these steps and you're growing every time. Like when you look back, I mean, I see growth, but when you look back, do you see where you've come from and sort of what that evolution has been for yourself personally, or what is that like for you?
I think if you're doing it right, you have some of that happen. I definitely can see a change in me, and I'm sure it's the same for all of the people listening, for yourself. I mean, you're not the same artist you were back when we met. You've changed your process. You've changed how you do things. You've tried experiments that have failed. And I've got a little sticky note. I'm not home today, but at home I've got a big giant 40-inch screen that sits about 6 inches from my face. That's my monitor, and around the edge of it, I've got sticky notes, and one of the sticky notes says, "You become what you do." And there's no school, there's no certification, there's no piece of paper that says, "Oh, ta-da, you're an artist now." As soon as you say, "I'm a songwriter," you're a songwriter, as long as you're writing songs. And I love that, but it also means that I become what I do. And so if I do it enough, then I become better at it, hopefully. And I can see that definitely, like with interviews. I can see that with how I approach the whole making of an album. Not every step is fraught with such terror as it was for the first few projects. You just
When you're writing the check or like sending the, hitting submit on the payment, that's is that the scary part?
Oh, it's more the risks that you take by opening yourself up in the studio, and
Mm.
especially with people you haven't worked before with. Me, one of the things I know about myself now, and that songwriting has taught me, is I love to hide. If you and I are in a crowd, you probably won't hear from me. Um,
Mm.
and I don't know why, but that's how I am. And so it's to just say that I'm going to release this album and I'm going to support it with these shows. That's a completely new thing for me. And I will tell you, I'm a teacher by day. And one of the things about teaching is you get paid by years of experience and education, right? And so when you hit the top of that scale, it's like, oh, there's no more incentive to there's no more hills to climb, right? In some ways. And so music came at a beautiful time for me, at least in the form I'm doing it now, where I'm like, oh, you'll never finish music. You're never going to get to the top of the hill on that one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's always changing, right? Like
Mhm.
even if you have what people would consider traditional success, like there's always something else. Um, so what's your favorite part of the album making process?
It's always the writing. The writing is 100% my favorite part. And I am reluctant sometimes to bring songs into a studio or to bring them farther than they are, just because I hold them close, or I really love them in how they, it's not right to fall in love with your stuff because you make poor choices then. But it's always the writing. It's always the writing.
Paul has another question. This is a great question too. What was it like selecting songs for your album? And I'm assuming you left some out. Like what? That's got to be tough.
Very tough. And I bet I'd love to hear Paul's answer to this, because I know he's either finishing or just completed I think it's the fourth album for the Sundogs. And so I would love to hear what his answer was on that. But for me, there were, I think, two or three that I really, really hoped that would make it onto the album, and they didn't. And I thought, okay, it's just not this time. And that's a lesson I learned from Ted Heineshevitz. He's got such encyclopedic background knowledge in music that he's like, oh, well, the Replacements, they recorded this song on this album, and then they tried recording a different, on these other previous albums, and it's just not its time. And eventually it made it onto an album. And so that idea of there's always more helps with that, because I'm like, oh, this is an orphan from this album, but it doesn't mean it won't go somewhere in the future.
And don't you think you could always release it as a single or something too? Like if maybe there's a special time for it to come out, and stuff like that too.
Are you a believer in that serendipity, that everything happens when it's supposed to? Because that's what I've been
Yep.
told. when I run up against a roadblock or a certain song won't be able to make it wherever. And people have told me, well, it's just not its time, and it'll find its time. Do you believe in that?
Totally. And I think about that when I sometimes find myself getting frustrated where things don't work out the way that I necessarily want them to. Um, I think about, like, I mean, this is kind of a morbid way to think about it, but think about like somebody whose alarm didn't go off and they didn't get on the plane that crashed,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like sometimes we think like, oh crap, something's messed up, but in reality, like, is it protecting us from something else? Like, is there a reason why there's a train blocking your way to work, right?
Right.
Like, is there a reason? So, but as a creative person and just my personality as a whole, like, I mean, it's easy to say, but not always easy to live. Do you feel that that's that way too?
Oh, for sure, for sure. And it really helps me to have this idea of stepping stones, right? So these two songs that were supposed to go, that I wanted on the album didn't make it. Well, that's a stepping stone to something else, right? And I think about that a lot with songwriting, because I don't write all stuff that I'm going to share out with the world. And so when I write one that's a particularly bad song, I'm like, oh, okay, that's a stepping stone to the next one, and I'll learn from this, and I'll eventually reach better. And so when a song doesn't make it on the album, I'm like, okay, well, it's not its time, and it's a stepping stone to whatever is. And the whole idea is momentum. If I can keep the momentum going, then there's room for all of these possibilities. It's never a dead end, right? There's always more.
Yeah. If anybody has any other questions, definitely put them in the chat. Happy to answer questions. Question for you, Doyle, then, is who's making that final call on what makes the album or not?
I think that Sarah is a really skilled person at communicating and also leading gently, because I think she's an artistic genius. And so we did reach a point where we had an artistic call here, must have been in August. And it was about a certain song where there's a break and there's a 3 or 4 second pause, and then it finishes up. And I wanted that to be a complete, end to end, from the beginning to the end. I wanted that on the album that way. And she said, no, we're going to take after the break, or the pause. That's going to be where it ends and it'll be the first track on the album. And then we're going to take that last 44 seconds and we're going to put it at the end of the album. And I didn't like that idea. And so we kind of battled back and forth. And finally I told her, I said, you know what? This is my 5th album, and I've made 4 albums where I get every artistic choice. And I didn't ask for you to be a part of this so that you could just agree with everything. And so we're going to do it the way you see it, because I trust you. And I think that you're a genius artistically. And so I'm going to follow that vision. But I 2 years ago, Doyle probably would have dug in his heels and, fought about that.
Well, now if it fails, you just blame Sarah, right? Like,
if you really like that, then it's my idea.
right? Where does Molly fit into this? Your wife, where does she fit in? Does she get to have a say?
Oh, for sure. She's the first listener all the time. The first person to, I want to say critic, but she's never critical. The first supporter, the first person to have a say about anything. And in fact, I put out a single at the end of July called Go to Town. And that song was not a song that I would have brought to where it's at now. And she said, you have to record this song. And I said, well, why? And she just said, I have this feeling. And, she's from New Hope, Minnesota. And
That's where I live. That's where I live. She's
got the New Hope second sight, so she can see into the future. And so I said, oh, okay. And so we did. And it did really, really well. So maybe you have the New Hope second sight. Do you have the New Hope second sight, Chad?
Possibly. I wasn't asked to listen to your album, though. So let's talk about the album then. Is there, some albums have a theme. Obviously, I know we've talked about there's a sound, but did you go into writing this from a certain perspective, like lyrically or like content wise, or what was that like for you?
No, we ran across, I'm constantly writing, and we ran across Paper Maps, the title track. And that song got a lot of exciting or excited reactions from so many people. And Sarah said, this is one that we need. And so then we kind of picked out the other songs that would match a little bit thematically. So the album starts off with all the stars, and it ends with every time I see a shooting star. And so you think about maps and navigation, that fits in thematically, right? So it starts and ends with stars, which are used for navigation. And then the paper maps thing is all of the things that happen to you in a lifetime, right? The things that you love, the things that you lose, all of those things are like an emotional map. And I'm an emotional writer, and so it seemed like it fit really, really well.
So tell me about Paper Maps then. What kind of led to that song, and how did I listen to it? Because it just came out. So people watching, you should go to all the streaming sites and look up Doyle Turner Paper Maps, which is a cool title for sure. But how did it come to you? What was that process like?
I was sitting in my son and daughter-in-law's first home that they bought in Middlesex, Vermont. And we sent him off to college on the East Coast to a big school, and he got a big degree, and he met this brilliant woman, and they got jobs at this big named university. And then pretty soon, after 18 months, they said, we're going to hike the Appalachian Trail. And they quit their jobs and they hiked the trail. And so then, to have them come back to buy a house, and then I'm sitting in this house alone, and all over the walls are these maps of places they've been, places that they, peaks that they want to hike. And, a normal person would be just bathed in joy because their son and daughter-in-law have bought their first house, and it's just this amazing thing. And I was sitting there looking at these maps thinking, they're not going to be my Minnesota neighbors. And so this whole song is based on this idea of, the same sun's on our faces, but we're so far apart. And so that's where it came from, was this idea of paper maps. And I love paper maps. I think they're awesome. I grew up using them. Sometimes when I was bored as a kid, I just look at maps. Maps are a great thing for me. And they're also, when you lay one out, what happens. All of a sudden you've got somebody shoulder to shoulder with you, and you're pointing out, oh, well, here's where I want to get to. Here's where I've been. All of that stuff really plays well thematically in terms of our life journey too.
Wow. So was all of that going through your mind while you're writing the song? Like, did you look at this metaphor from all those different angles during the process, or what was that like?
No, I looked at it just from the sadness that comes from a dad realizing that their kids probably settled and put down roots across the country. And then this was part of what Sarah's questions led to through pre-production, is like, all of that thematic stuff. And I didn't see it when I first started talking about that with her. And that's a really good thing to remember too, is that we don't always see the end product when we start. And at least I don't. When I start writing a song, I always find out that I'm writing to find out. And as I write, then it happens. And the same thing with this conversation. When she started asking these questions, they were annoying and they were poking. And I was just like, well, I thought we were supposed to be deciding like what kind of instruments and what, moving around lyrics and all this kind of stuff. And she was leading me along to a thematic idea. And so, yeah, most of that comes from that conversation.
It's like, damn it, Morris. That's awesome though. And I love what you just said, that you're writing to find out. Like that's a cool concept, right? Like we hear people say, like, let the song sort of become what it's going to be. And it sounds like you're just kind of the explorer, like seeing where the song goes. I love that.
Yeah. And for me, I'm such a feeling person, such an emotional person, that I always try to write to that emotion. Because if I'm feeling it, there's a likelihood somebody else out there is feeling it. And so I explore. Yeah, I try to match the words and the music and the groove to be the best vehicle to bring that forward.
So yeah, so let's go a little deep into process or craft then. So what you just said, you try to write to an emotion. I talk about that a lot, where it's about all of the different elements working together. How do you personally, how do you approach that? Like when you say, I want to write, you said this song you want to write about sadness or the sadness a father feels because, the kids are kind of doing something that you didn't necessarily expect or suspect. And like, it sounds like they're doing awesome, like following their dreams of doing what they love, but that's not always easy. So you're coming from this sadness. How do you turn that sadness into a song?
Um, I always used to think there was some kind of a magic formula for writing songs, and I find that it's just guess and test. And so I wade my way through all of the cliches that come up, and I just write through it. Rarely do I start off with a really clear, oh, this is the thing. I because of that singer songwriter challenge group, I can write quickly. But I always start off with, okay, the first half a page or whatever I'm getting at is going to be just junk I've heard before and junk nobody wants to see. And sometimes I find my way out of the cliche woods, and sometimes I get lost.
Do you normally start with lyrics or do you start with music, or is it both?
I do both. And lately it's been more groove based just because I feel, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started. I feel like I've been on about a 9 or a 10 month, maybe not going downhill songwriting wise, but not just kind of a steady line rather than uh, feeling all of that, oh, I won the lottery after a song's done feeling that we all get.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that's about. I just know that I'm still writing through that, and that I'll find the edge of the chocolate swamp here one of these days and climb up on solid ground again. And I'm thinking it might have something to do with, when I first started writing, when you and I first met, we met at a songwriting workshop, and I was chewing up everything I could find about songwriting because I was going to learn how to do this. And part of it was your workshop that we met at. And I remember sitting in that workshop, and it was just like all the light bulbs were firing off, and I was getting so excited because you were speaking my language. And I also got to a point where I was doing so much of that education that I got to a point where it's like, okay, I really need to step back now and just write. And I did that for a couple of years. And now I'm wondering if it's time for me to put more information in my head.
Yeah, I just did a workshop this week, basically how to start writing songs for beginners. And that's what I told people there that were maybe more experienced. I'm like, it never hurts to go back to the fundamentals because the fundamentals of it don't change, right? So, and I do think, was it Bruce Springsteen that said that there's an input part of your songwriting and there's an output part of your songwriting? So sometimes if you're doing all output, you have to stop and then put some new stuff into your mind, and maybe that's experiencing new things, or maybe it's listening to new things. And I know before we started, you were saying that you just feel like you've written a lot and now it's you're kind of taking a break, which I think is kind of okay, right? Does it feel that way for you? Does it feel like this is a time where it's like, it's okay if I'm not writing as much as I was?
Right. And I still am an active writer. I'm writing every day. I do my morning pages. And then I'm also, I finished a co-write with Dave Novak about a week and a half ago. But I'm just not at that breakneck pace that I have written at before. And I think that you're right, that it's okay to take a breather a little bit. And what he said about inputs, for sure. I travel with no less than like 5 books, and I'm constantly trying to make sure I'm reading, because that's the best way to become a strong writer, is by reading. And I know I'm really bad about my listening habits, where I just like find something and I want to listen 400 times.
Yeah.
And so I try to expand that as well. And so I'm writing my morning pages while I'm listening to like jazz instrumentals, because I'm such a lyrics focused person that they'll draw me off. The other thing I wanted to say is that I was terrified of slowing down writing for many years, because I thought I hadn't written for so many years that I didn't want to go back to that stagnation that I had. And so I was really, really worried about that. And so I just kept writing at a breakneck pace. And now I feel like I've got enough confidence in writing that I know that even though I'm not writing once a week, a song a week or whatever, I'm still actively a writer, and I know I'll get back to a quicker pace in the future.
Paul asked another question. He said, when you're writing a song, how much do you brainstorm and throw away? Do you feel that you throw away or just not use things that you come up with? What's your kind of ratio there?
Oh, I don't know if I think it changes from song to song. And there's probably, Paul, some songs that you've heard in the challenge that you thought, ooh, this is one that should have been thrown away. But for me, it's about momentum. And so, like, sometimes when I start lyrically, I'll write a page or two, kind of that object writing that you showed us from Pat Pattison.
Yeah.
And I'll do that object writing, and then I'll start the lyrics up above on the document, because I'm writing on the computer mostly. And it's been kind of embarrassing sometimes, because I will send those lyrics off, or whatever, and some of that ramblings in the bottom, and people are like, "Oh, you really went through a process." I'm like, "Darn, I forgot to take that out."
That's funny. Yeah, they're probably like, "What the heck was that?"
Here's a message from Planet Madness.
So your album comes out on November 9th?
November 9th. Yep. We're having a big release show up in St. Joseph, and it's at a listening room set up called Century Oak Studios, and on the property are two of the oldest documented oak trees in Stearns County. And
oh, interesting.
I played a concert out there under those, and they're just awesome. But this Joe and Susan Myers have kind of created this beautiful spot for music, where they have an old dairy barn, and they've refurbished the top of it and decorated it, and it's beautiful, and it's a listening room. But they also have like those big giant wooden spools that electric companies spool wire on.
Yeah.
And so you can sit around a couple of those in the back, and so it's not hoity-toity at all. It's very accessible, but it's also a beautiful space, and the sound is awesome. And so we're really excited to present that, even though it's not in Minneapolis proper. It's a little bit of a journey for people to hear paper maps.
There you go. You should send out paper maps as invitations. That would be a cool marketing thing.
I sent them out. Yep.
Awesome.
And I color printed two sides, and I didn't get a full, accordion fold, but I sent out these nice invitations, and they had a QR code for the ticket link and all that kind of stuff. And yeah.
I know it's a listening room. Are you playing live, or is it more of a playing through the album?
Oh, we're going to play live, and I think 3 of the musicians that were on the album will be there performing. So you'll get to hear Dan Schwartz, and you get to hear Matt Blake, and you get to hear Jordan Carlson. And Sarah's going to come and sing, and it's just going to be a big old party. And then we've got Haley Rydell from the cities here, who will open up the show for us.
Haley's been on the channel too. This is my producer, Jake.
Hey, Jake. What a sweet dog.
I think he's like, it's about time to wrap up. I'm home alone with the dogs this weekend. So Josh is in Seattle. So it's just me and the boys. So I've done 2 workshops in a row. They're getting to the point where they're like, it's time.
Yeah, we need a little time.
Well, Doyle, this has been awesome to talk. So people can find you. What are your socials and all of that?
The best place is doyleturner.com. You can go there and check out the links to all of this stuff. And I'm also on Instagram with Doyle Turner Music, and I'm also on Facebook with Doyle Turner Music, and yeah, all over the place, and try to cover all the bases.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing this album journey. Like I'm inspired, and I love just hearing the process that you went through, because it's so different than what I do. And I think a lot of people watching will relate to it as well. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on. I've just always enjoyed talking songwriting with you, because you're so knowledgeable, and you helped me along in my journey so much.
And we'll have you back again soon when I don't have to babysit.